One of the things I hear over and over again when it comes to determining whether or not there really is a God is that there's just no good evidence that he's there. If God were real, why does he seem so hidden from us? Wouldn't God want to make his existence obvious to us, especially if his goal was to get us to believe in him? Shouldn't we have more proof than we do? Honestly, this is something that I think we all struggle with. There are many times where it seems like God is just disturbingly absent and his reality is just not at all obvious. I would think that many Christians have found themselves at one time or another thinking something to the effect of, God, if you're there, just make my bedroom curtain move. Or just think of somebody like Job in the Old Testament, who experienced immense forms of suffering, and it seemed like God was nowhere to be found. So what can we think about it? How can we handle this problem? And why does God seem so hidden and immune to the evidence? Well, there are a couple of ways that we can approach these questions, but the first thing worth mentioning is that it doesn't really seem to be the case that God is so hidden from everyone, at least in the sense of nobody seeming to know about him. According to the Pew Research Center's 2015 data, the vast majority of the world believes in God or something like God, with over 4 billion people believing in the monotheistic God like that of Christianity. So it's just not really true that God is as obscure as some people think. But maybe the thought is that because you can't verify God's existence through science or through your physical senses, then you can't know that he's real. But there's got to be more here than just that. This sort of thinking was actually the way a good many intellectuals coming out of the Enlightenment would test for truth. If science couldn't verify it, then it was considered to be unknowable. This view is actually called scientism, and philosophers today have almost universally rejected it. Why? Well, because it's just demonstrably false. There are all sorts of things that you can know to be true, but that can't be verified scientifically. For example, how do you know that the past wasn't created 2 minutes ago with memories built into your mind and everything having the appearance of age? You can't use science to prove that that didn't actually happen. Or maybe you've heard something like this before. How do you know that you're not just a body in the matrix being programmed to think that you're watching this video and to have the sensations that you're having? We all reasonably know that we aren't in those particular situations, yet that cannot be proven by science. And what's even worse is that the claim that science is the only way to show something is true actually shoots itself in the foot. That statement itself cannot be scientifically proven, and so by its own standard is false. So if it's true, then it's not true, which is just a contradiction, which is why many philosophers today reject this idea. So when we think about God, we need to think beyond just apprehending him with science or the physical senses. Okay, but even given a broader understanding of how it is we come to know the truth, it could still be said that there's just no evidence for God at all. A couple of things here. First, just because there's no evidence for something, it does not necessarily mean that that thing does not exist. For example, the lack of evidence that the number of stars in the known universe is an even number does not in fact mean that that number is not even. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Or the lack of evidence for there being gold on Mars is not evidence that there is no gold on Mars. Maybe we haven't looked in the right spot, or maybe we haven't looked at all. The lack of evidence for something can only count against it if the proper expectation of evidence is not being met. So if you expect to find something in particular and you don't find it, that can count as evidence against it. Take the gold example. If someone says to you, there's gold in the jar on the counter, and you go and look at the jar on the counter and you don't see any gold, that can count as evidence against it, because if there were gold in the jar, then you would see gold in the jar. So the question is, if God is real, then what sort of evidence is proper for us to expect to find? That's not as obvious as you might think, which leads me to another point. The even bigger assumption lurking in the background here is that there is no evidence for God, and that's just not true at all. There are a ton of good arguments that make the existence of God more probable than not, and these are actually discussed by a great deal of academics today. Just to name a few, arguments for a personal and necessary foundation to reality, arguments for a cause of the beginning of the universe, arguments from the fine-tuning of the universe to an intelligent designer, arguments for God as the basis of objective moral values and duties, and a whole bunch more. Even more, if Jesus of Nazareth was who he claimed to be, and he really did rise from the dead, then we have in our history an absolutely tangible revelation of God himself. And these aren't just fun speculations. These are extremely well thought out ideas with loads of scholarly study behind them. If you're interested in getting your feet wet with some of these arguments and evidences, check out Lee Strobel's books, The Case for a Creator and The Case for Christ, or William Lane Craig's On Guard. If you want something a little bit more rigorous, check out William Lane Craig's Reasonable Faith, or a volume entitled 24 or so Arguments for God, which is a compilation of a whole bunch of philosophers' arguments for the existence of God. And if you really want to convince yourself that this is not just a philosophical side project, check out the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, which is a high-level academic discussion on arguments for and against a theistic worldview. But maybe some people still think that that's not good enough. Maybe they think that God needs to make his existence super obvious so that no one disbelieves. Send some fiery chariots, or make the words "I exist" appear on the inside of everyone's eyelids. Here's the thing. On the Christian view, at least, God isn't just concerned with getting people to believe that he's real, but instead he wants people to enter into a relationship with him. That's what will fulfill them, and that's why they were created in the first place. Even Jesus' brother James noted that the demons believe God exists, but they shudder. So it's not clear that if God's existence were more obvious, that more people would enter into a relationship with him. In fact, if you look at the history of the nation of Israel, the reports are often exactly the opposite. God was supposedly as clear as a pillar of fire and a pillar of smoke to them. They heard his voice. They saw his power. It's likely that no one in Israel doubted that God was real. Yet time and time again, they rebelled against him, they rejected him, and they made their own gods to worship. This just goes to show that God's existence being clear doesn't necessarily mean that people will want a relationship with him. And then on the flip side, we have cases like Job, where God does seem so silent and so hidden, and yet his faith is unwavering. So, if somebody's going to claim that God's existence being more obvious would bring more people into a relationship with him, then they're the ones that need to show that that is in fact the case. Maybe God has orchestrated every detail of the world and revealed himself in just the right ways to people all throughout history so that the number of people who freely choose him is maximized. One of Jesus' followers, Luke, seemed to believe that this is exactly what God did. He wrote, "From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he's not far from any one of us." Lastly, it's important to remember that if our physical senses are not the only way to know things, if scientism is not true, then we shouldn't limit ourselves to just looking for that kind of evidence. If God exists and he's a real person, we could expect to experience him in a personal and an intimate way, the same way that we know our friends and our family are real people and not just biological machines made out of matter. If you feel that God is absent from your experience of reality, reach out to him. Talk to him, seek him with an open mind. If you do, I think that you'll find that God isn't so hidden after all, and he'll become a part of your life that is undeniably real.